Elena in her white doctor's coat, a 6-year-old girl clutching her leg tightly, while a line of suited mafia guards look on in shock. For 2 years, the heiress to the Seoul underworld didn't touch a soul. Not her father, not the world's best specialists. Then she saw me, a stranger, and she wouldn't let go.
AMBW Elena.
2 days ago, I was just a surgeon doing my rounds. Today, I'm the golden cage prisoner of Kangdae, the city's most feared man. He didn't hire me to heal his daughter. He bought the entire hospital just to keep me by her side. But in this mansion of stone and secrets, I just overheard something that could end us all. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something real quick. Where in the world are you watching this from? Your city and your country? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And I reply too. I love seeing how far these stories travel. It reminds me we're not just strangers on a screen. We're not just creators and listeners here. We're a family. So if you're part of this family, take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps this story reach more people like you. Because what I'm about to tell you is not just a story. It's about trust, about betrayal, and the kind of evil that doesn't look dangerous until it's already too late. And it all started in a place that was supposed to be safe. The air in the Seoul International Medical Center always smelled of sterile lavender and quiet desperation. But on that Tuesday, the atmosphere felt unnervingly heavy. Dr. Elena adjusted her stethoscope, her dark skin a striking contrast against the crisp white of her lab coat as she moved through the VIP wing. She was used to the hushed tones and the way the air seemed to thin when high-profile patients arrived. But she had no idea that the silent shift in the hallway's pressure was the precursor to a storm that would redefine her entire existence. For 2 years, a legend had circulated through the elite medical circles of South Korea. A ghost story about a child who lived in a fortress of silence. Min-ho, the only daughter of Kangdae, was a name spoken in whispers. After the tragic accident that had claimed her mother's life, the 6-year-old girl had retreated into a shell so thick that even the most renowned child psychologists in Asia couldn't crack it. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. Most importantly, she refused to touch or be touched by any living soul. Nannies had been fired by the dozens. Specialists had been dismissed with cold, terrifying finality by her father. The girl was a frozen masterpiece of trauma, moving through the world as if she were made of glass that would shatter if a human hand grew too close. Elena was finishing her notes on a chart when the elevator at the end of the hall chimed with a sound like a funeral bell. The heavy doors slid open, and the world seemed to stop spinning. A phalanx of men in razor-sharp black suits stepped out first, their eyes scanning the corridor with predatory precision. In the center of the formation stood a man who radiated a bone-chilling cold. Kangdae didn't walk. He moved like a glacier, slow, inevitable, and destructive. But it wasn't the Mafia Boss who held Elena's gaze. It was the small, fragile shadow walking beside him. Min-ho looked like a doll carved from porcelain. Her black hair was pulled back into a perfect, tight bow, and her eyes were wide, dark voids that seemed to see things no child should ever witness. She moved with a stiff, robotic grace, her hands tucked neatly into the pockets of her velvet coat, ensuring no part of her skin could accidentally brush against the bustling world around her. Elena stood still, respecting the unspoken rule of the VIP wing. Do not stare, do not move unless asked, and stay out of the way of the men with guns under their jackets. She waited for the procession to pass so she could return to the pediatric ward. But as the group drew level with her, something inexplicable happened. The ice heiress, the girl who had spent 730 days in a self-imposed exile from human contact, suddenly stopped. The guards halted instantly, hand moving toward their lapels. Kangdae stopped, his brow furrowing as he looked down at his daughter. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the hospital's ventilation system. Then, Min-ho broke the formation. She didn't just walk. She ran. Her small shoes clicked against the polished linoleum, a frantic, rhythmic sound that shattered the silence of the hall. The guards reacted with panicked confusion. But Kangdae held up a hand, his eyes tracking his daughter with a mixture of shock and sudden, sharp intensity. Min-ho headed straight for Elena. Elena felt her heart hammer against her ribs. She was a stranger, an expat doctor who had spent years earning her place in this prestigious institution through sheer brilliance and a stubborn refusal to back down from a challenge. She had seen everything from gunshot wounds to rare tropical diseases, but she was not prepared for the tiny force of nature currently barreling toward her. Minho reached her and didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her small, pale hands flying out to grab the hem of Elena's white lab coat. She gripped the fabric so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, she buried her face against Elena's hip, clinging to her with a desperation that felt like a drowning person catching a life raft. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the hallway. One of the lead guards moved forward, his face a mask of aggression. "Step away from the child," he barked, his hand reaching out to pull Minho back. "No." Kangdae's voice cut through the air like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying gravity that anchored everyone to the floor. He stepped forward, the space between him and Elena disappearing until she could smell the expensive tobacco and cold rain clinging to his coat. He was taller than she expected, a wall of dark charisma and suppressed violence. He looked down at his daughter, who was trembling now, her fingers twisting deeper into Elena's coat. Minho's eyes were shut tight, her face hidden, but she refused to let go. For the first time in 2 years, she was choosing to be anchored to someone. Elena looked down at the child, her doctor's instinct overriding her fear. She could feel the heat radiating from the girl's forehead and the frantic, shallow rhythm of her breathing. Without thinking about the consequences, without considering that the man standing before her could have her erased from the city by sunset, Elena slowly lowered her hand. She didn't grab the child. She simply rested her palm near Minho's shoulder, offering a silent, steady presence. "She's having a panic attack," Elena said, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She looked up, meeting Kangdae's piercing, obsidian gaze. "Your men are crowding her. If you want her to breathe, they need to back off. Now." The silence that followed was deafening. The guards looked like they were waiting for the order to execute her for her insolence. Kangdae stared at Elena, his eyes scanning her face, her badge, and the way she didn't flinch under his scrutiny. He saw the way his daughter, who had rejected every elite nanny and world-class specialist, was currently holding on to this woman as if her life depended on it. "Back up," Kangdae ordered his men, never taking his eyes off Elena. The guards retreated 10 paces, their faces pale with disbelief. Kangdae leaned in closer, his shadow falling over Elena and the child. "For 2 years, he whispered, a sound like dry leaves on a grave. "My daughter has been a ghost. She has not touched a living person since the day her mother died." "Why you, doctor?" "I don't know," Elena replied honestly, her gaze never wavering. "Maybe she just realized she's tired of being alone." Minho let out a small, muffled sob into the fabric of the lab coat, the first sound anyone had heard from her in a long time. Elena felt a pang of pure, unadulterated empathy. She didn't see the mafia boss's daughter. She saw a broken little girl lost in a storm. "She isn't letting go," Kangdae observed, his voice shifting from cold curiosity to something more predatory, more possessive. He looked at the way Elena's hand was now gently shielding the child's head. "And if she won't let go of you, then you belong to her now." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. She realized in that moment that her life as a regular physician was over. The mundane world of shifts, charts, and quiet coffee breaks had vanished the second those small hands gripped her coat. "I have rounds, Mr. Kong." Elena tried to maintain her professional boundary, though she knew it was crumbling. "I have patients who—" "You have one patient," Kangdae interrupted, his voice final. He stepped back and signaled to his lead guard. "Clear her schedule. By the wing. By the hospital if the board hesitates. From this moment, Dr. Elena is the personal physician to the House of Kong." He looked at Elena one last time, a dark, undecipherable promise in his eyes. "Take care of her, doctor. Because if she loses her voice again, you will lose much more than your career." As the guards began to cordon off the area, turning the public hallway into a private fortress, Elena looked down at the girl still clinging to her coat. Minho looked up, her dark eyes meeting Elena's. There was no joy in them yet, only a desperate, haunting plea for safety. Elena took a deep breath, reached down, and for the first time, she didn't just let the child hold her. She wrapped her arms around the girl and picked her up. The weight of the child felt like a vow. Elena looked at the Mafia Boss, who was watching them with a terrifying intensity, and she realized the truth. The girl had chosen her, but in the world of the Kong Syndicate, choice was just another word for destiny. And their destiny had just begun. The fluorescent lights of the hospital's administrative wing hummed with a low, clinical anxiety that Elena had grown used to over the years, but tonight, the sound felt like a warning. She sat at her mahogany desk, the surface cluttered with patient files and a half-empty cup of cold coffee, trying to process the tremors still radiating through her hands. It had been exactly 4 hours since Minho had clung to her lab coat in the VIP corridor, and the silence of her private office felt less like peace and more like the breath held before a plunge. She was a doctor, a woman who dealt in the hard currency of biology and trauma. Yet she couldn't find a medical entry for the way Kangdae's eyes had looked at her, as if she were a rare specimen he had just decided to collect. The heavy oak door to her office didn't creak. It swung open with the silent, balanced weight of authority that ignored locks. Elena didn't look up immediately. She knew the rhythm of the footsteps. They weren't the hurried pitter-patter of a nurse or the weary trudge of a resident. They were heavy, deliberate, and carried the scent of expensive cedarwood and the sharp, metallic tang of rain. Kangdae stepped into the room, his presence instantly shrinking the four walls until Elena felt as though she were trapped in a cage of his making. He didn't wait for an invitation. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply moved to the window, looking out at the glittering, neon-soaked skyline of Seoul as if he owned every light in the city. "Your credentials are impeccable, Dr. Elena," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and settle straight in her chest. "Johns Hopkins, a residency in London, 3 years of trauma surgery in Chicago. You came to Korea to escape the noise, perhaps? Or to find a challenge that matched your intellect?" He turned then, his silhouette framed by the skyscrapers. His suit was charcoal, darker than the night outside, and his face was a mask of aristocratic coldness. "It doesn't matter why you came. What matters is why you are staying." Elena straightened her back, meeting his gaze with the practiced neutrality she used for difficult diagnoses. "Mr. Kong, I appreciate the interest in my career, but I have a department to run. If this is about Minho's follow-up appointment, my secretary can." "You aren't listening," Kangdae interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a velvet threat. He walked toward her desk, placing a thick, leather-bound folder on the blotter. "As of 20 minutes ago, the board of directors has finalized the sale of this hospital. I am now the primary shareholder, and as your employer, I am reassessing your role. You are no longer the chief of pediatrics. You are the personal physician to my daughter. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week." The air left Elena's lungs in a rush. "You can't just buy a hospital to rearrange my life. That's not how medicine works. I have other patients, children who rely on me, surgery scheduled for tomorrow morning. Those children will be seen by the best doctors money can provide," Kangdae said, leaning over her desk until his face was inches from hers. His eyes were obsidian, reflecting nothing. "But my daughter has chosen you. For 2 years, she has been a ghost in her own home. Today she touched you. She sought your warmth. In my world, when a treasure identifies what it needs to survive, I provide it. I don't ask for permission, doctor. I command results." Elena felt a surge of indignation, the spark of the woman who had survived the roughest ERs in Chicago. "I am a doctor, not a servant. You can't trap me in a mansion just because your daughter held my coat." Kangdae's lips didn't move into a smile, but the corners of his eyes tightened in a way that was far more terrifying. "Trap? No. I am offering you the most sophisticated medical facility in the country, built within the walls of my estate. I am offering you a salary that would take you 3 lifetimes to earn here, and in return you will give my daughter back her voice. If you refuse, I will ensure your medical license is revoked in every territory on this map. You will never hold a scalpel again." You will never help another child. You will be a phantom, just like she was. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elena looked at the folder on her desk, the contract of her promotion. She saw the power in his hands, the way he moved with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been told no, and lived to hear it a second time. She thought of Minho's small, trembling hands. She thought of the desperate plea in the child's eyes. It wasn't just about the threats, it was about the girl. Elena knew that if she walked away, Minho would sink back into that dark, silent ocean, and this time, she might never surface. I need my equipment, Elena said, her voice a whisper of surrender. And I need autonomy. If I am her doctor, I am in charge of her environment. Your men stay back. You stay back. Kangdae straightened up, his expression unreadable. Agreed. My driver is waiting at the south entrance. You have 10 minutes to pack your essentials. The rest will be purchased for you. The transition was a blur of high-speed motion and shadows. Elena was ushered into the back of a black sedan, the glass so thick it distorted the world outside into a smeared painting of gray and blue. Two men sat in the front, their necks thick and their eyes constantly scanning the mirrors. They didn't speak. The car moved with a ghostly silence, weaving through the traffic of Seoul before turning toward the winding, forested roads that led to the exclusive hills of Songbuk-dong. The estate appeared like a fortress from a Gothic nightmare, modernized with steel and glass. High concrete walls topped with rhythmic pulses of electronic sensors gave way to a massive iron gate that opened only after a series of biometric scans. As the car rolled up the long gravel driveway, Elena saw the silhouettes of men positioned on the perimeter, motionless, armed, and lethal. This wasn't a home. It was a sovereign nation with its own laws and its own king. The mansion itself was a sprawling architectural marvel of dark stone and floor-to-ceiling glass, perched on a cliffside that looked down into a valley of mist. It was beautiful, but it felt cold, the kind of beauty that came from a place of isolation rather than comfort. When the car stopped, the door was opened for her by a man whose suit was so perfectly tailored it looked like armor. "This way, doctor," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Elena was led through a grand foyer where the floors were polished obsidian, reflecting the dim, amber glow of recessed lighting. Every step she took echoed, a lonely sound in a house built for a much larger family than it currently held. They passed rooms filled with priceless art and ancient artifacts. But there were no photographs, no stray toys, no signs of the messy, vibrant life of a 6-year-old. It was a museum of grief. They reached a set of double doors on the second floor. The guard paused, turning to Elena with a look that was almost a warning. "The child is inside. She has been waiting for you." Elena pushed the doors open and stepped into a suite that felt like a world apart. The air here was warmer, smelling faintly of jasmine and old books. The room was massive, filled with soft silks and plush carpets. But in the center of a large, circular bed, Minho sat perfectly still. She was still wearing her velvet coat, her small hands folded in her lap. When she saw Elena, her entire body seemed to unlock. She didn't move, but the tension left her shoulders, and her eyes anchored onto Elena with a terrifying intensity. Elena walked across the room, her heart aching for the girl. "I'm here, Minho," she said softly, kneeling by the bed. "I told you I wouldn't go far." The child reached out, her fingers brushing the sleeve of Elena's sweater, confirming her reality. Elena felt the weight of the golden cage then, the realization that she was now the only light in this girl's dark world. She spent the next hour moving through the suite, checking the medical monitors hidden behind elegant wood panels, noting the state-of-the-art infirmary attached to the bedroom. Kangdae had lied about nothing. The medical setup was better than many hospitals. But as the night deepened, the reality of the mafia element of her new life made its first violent intrusion. Elena was standing on the balcony, looking out at the dark forest, when she heard the heavy thud of the suite doors opening. She expected a maid or a guard with her luggage. Instead, she saw Kangdae. His jaw was set, and there was a streak of something dark, blood, she realized with a jolt, on the cuff of his shirt. He didn't look at her. He walked straight to the small table near the window where a bottle of amber liquid sat. He poured a glass, his movements jerky and filled with a suppressed rage. "Don't look at me," he commanded, his back to her. Elena froze, her hand gripping the balcony railing. "Just listen." His voice was different now. Not the cold, calculated tone of the office, but something raw and jagged. "In this house, there are rules that have nothing to do with medicine. You are here to heal my daughter, but you are also now part of the perimeter. If you see something you do not understand, you forget it. If you hear a sound in the night that does not belong in a nursery, you stay in this room. My enemies are many, and they do not care about Hippocratic oaths." He turned then, and for the first time Elena saw the crack in the ice. There was a flickering shadow in his eyes, a look of a man who was fighting a war on 100 fronts, and was starting to realize that his greatest weakness was the small girl sleeping in the next room. "You think this is a cage," Kangde said, walking toward her until he was standing in the doorway to the balcony. The wind caught his hair, making him look wilder, more dangerous. "And perhaps it is. But it is the only place in this world where she is safe. And now, it is the only place where you are safe." "Safe from what?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "From you. From the people who think that killing a doctor is the best way to break a father," he replied. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face but never touching her, as if he were afraid his own darkness would stain her. "You saved her today. You brought a spark back to her eyes that I haven't seen since the day I watched her mother burn. Do not mistake my commands for cruelty, Elena. I am simply a man who knows that in the dark, the only way to keep a light burning is to build a wall around it." He finished his drink in one swallow and set the glass down with a finality that echoed through the room. Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving the scent of cedar and copper behind him. Elena stood on the balcony for a long time after he left, the cold wind biting at her skin. She looked back at the bed where Minho had finally fallen into a fitful sleep. She was trapped in a palace of secrets, guarded by a man who was half beast and half monarch, serving a child who spoke only with her eyes. The golden cage had closed its doors, and as she watched the moonlight dance on the bulletproof glass, Elena realized that she wasn't just there to heal a child. She was there to survive a dynasty. The weight of the silence in the mansion felt heavy, like the pressure at the bottom of the ocean. She walked back inside and sat in the chair beside Minho's bed, her eyes fixed on the door. She thought of the war Kangde had mentioned, the enemies lurking in the mist of the valley below. She was a doctor, but tonight, as she listened to the rhythmic breathing of the mafia's air, she felt like a soldier. She closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. In the House of Kong, sleep was a luxury that neither the king nor his new prisoner could afford. The walls of the mansion seemed to pulse with the hidden machinery of the syndicate. Somewhere below her, she knew, there were rooms where maps were spread out and lives were traded like currency. Somewhere, the people who had caused Minho's trauma were still moving, still planning. Elena gripped the armrests of her chair, her mind racing. She had been thrust into the heart of a conflict she didn't understand, armed only with her knowledge of the human body and her refusal to let a child suffer. As the first hint of gray light began to touch the horizon, Elena looked at her reflection in the darkened window. She looked the same, but she felt fundamentally altered. She was no longer just Dr. Elena from Chicago. She was the woman who had walked into the mouth of the lion to save a lamb, only to realize the lion intended to keep her as well. The golden cage was beautiful, and it was deadly, and as the sun began to rise over the fortress, Elena knew that the real challenge wasn't going to be making Minho speak. It was going to be making sure they both survived long enough to hear what she had to say. The silence of the Kong estate was different from the silence of a hospital. In a hospital, quiet was a vacuum waiting to be filled by the beep of a monitor or the frantic pace of a code blue. But here, the silence was a heavy, intentional weight. It lived in the corners of the cavernous rooms and draped itself over the priceless tapestries like a shroud. For the first week of her residency in the Golden Cage, Elena spent her hours observing Minho. She didn't push. She didn't probe with cold medical instruments or clinical questions that the child couldn't, or wouldn't, answer. Instead, Elena sat on the plush floor of the nursery, her own presence a quiet constant in the girl's peripheral vision. She began to realize that Minho's mutism was not a physiological failure of the vocal cords or a neurological disconnect. She had reviewed the scans a dozen times. The brain was perfect, the throat was clear. This was a choice, a biological fortress built out of the scorched earth of trauma. Minho wasn't broken. She was hiding. Her silence was a shield, a way to ensure that if she never spoke, she could never lose another person she loved to the violent world her father ruled. Words were bridges, and Minho had burned every one of them to keep the monsters on the other side. Elena knew that to reach a child who had retreated so far inward, she couldn't use the language of medicine. She had to use the language of the soul. On the 8th day, Elena brought a small, portable record player into the suite, along with a stack of vinyl records she had scavenged from a dusty shop in Itaewon before her promotion. She didn't ask for permission. She simply sat by the window, where the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and dropped the needle on a vintage jazz record. The smooth, soulful rasp of a saxophone began to fill the room, weaving through the cold, modern edges of the mansion. Minho, who was sitting at her small white table meticulously lining up colored pencils in a row, froze. Her small ears twitched. She didn't look up, but the hand reaching for a blue pencil paused mid-air. Elena didn't say a word. She pulled out a large sketchbook and a set of charcoal sticks, beginning to draw the view of the valley outside. For hours they sat in a shared bubble of sound. The music shifted from jazz to classical, then to upbeat bossa nova. Elena watched out of the corner of her eye as Minho's rigid posture began to soften. The child's shoulders, usually hiked up to her ears in a permanent defensive crouch, slowly lowered. By the 3rd day of the music therapy, Minho had moved her chair 6 inches closer to Elena. Art became their secondary bridge. Elena noticed that Minho's drawings were always the same. A large black circle in the middle of a white page. It was a void, a representation of the accident that had swallowed her mother and her voice. Elena began to intervene, not with words, but with color. One afternoon, while Minho was staring at her latest black circle, Elena reached over and placed a small, vibrant yellow right in the center of the darkness. Minho's eyes went wide. She looked at the yellow, then at Elena, her expression a mix of confusion and wonder. Elena handed her a bright red pastel. "It's a spark," Elena whispered, the first words she had spoken in an hour. Even in the dark, there is always a spark. The breakthrough didn't happen in a moment of grand drama. It happened over a pile of finger paints. Elena had covered the entire floor of the nursery in heavy butcher paper, stripping off her professional blazer and rolling up her sleeves. She began to smear vibrant greens and deep blues across the paper, creating an abstract forest. Minho watched from the edge of the paper, her hands tucked into her sleeves. Elena dipped her hand into a jar of bright orange paint and made a messy, ridiculous sun in the corner of the sky. Then, purposefully, she accidentally smeared a bit of orange paint on her own nose. She looked at Minho with an exaggerated expression of shock.
Minho's lips twitched.
It was a microscopic movement, but to Elena, it felt like an earthquake. Elena did it again, this time putting a smudge of purple on her chin and making a silly face, squinting her eyes and sticking out her tongue. The absurdity of a world-class surgeon covered in primary colors, looking like a disheveled rainbow, was too much for the fortress to hold. A sound erupted from Minho's throat. It wasn't a word, but it was better. It was a bubble of air, a short, sharp intake of breath that blossomed into a high-pitched, melodic trill. Minho was laughing. It was a small, rusty sound, as if the machinery of her joy hadn't been used in a lifetime, but it grew. Soon, the girl was doubled over, her small hands finally coming out of her sleeves to cover her mouth as she giggled, her eyes sparkling with a light that hadn't been there for 2 years. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, but she kept the silly face, joining in the laughter. In that moment, the golden cage didn't feel like a prison. Felt like a nursery. High above them, in the shadows of the darkened gallery that overlooked the nursery, a figure stood motionless. Kangdae had been watching for 20 minutes. He was a man who dealt in the currency of fear and the finality of death. A man whose heart had been encased in permafrost since the night he held his dying wife in the wreckage of a car. He had seen the world at its ugliest, and he had become the ugliest thing in it to protect what was left. But as the sound of his daughter's laughter drifted up to the gallery, something in his chest shifted. It was a violent, painful sensation, like a bone being reset. He watched Elena, this woman he had abducted from her life, this doctor who refused to be afraid of him, as she sat on the floor, covered in paint, making a fool of herself just to see a child smile. He saw the way she looked at Min-ho, with a genuine, fierce love that had nothing to do with the contract or the money. Kang-dae's grip on the mahogany railing tightened. For years, he had believed that the only way to keep Min-ho safe was to keep her hidden, to keep her frozen in a world where nothing could ever change because nothing was allowed to live. But watching her now, he realized that Elena was doing something he could never do. She wasn't just keeping Min-ho alive, she was bringing her back to life. The icy exterior he wore like armor cracked. It wasn't a total shatter. Men like Kang-dae did not melt overnight, but a hairline fracture appeared. He found himself mesmerized by the sight of Elena's dark skin splashed with the bright colors of the paint, the way her laughter harmonized with his daughter's. She was the sun, and for the first time in a long time, the King of Shadows felt the warmth. He turned away before they could see him, stepping back into the darkness of the hallway. His face was still a mask of iron, but his breath was ragged. He walked back to his office, his mind racing. He had brought Elena into his home to be a tool, a medical asset to be used and eventually discarded. But as he sat at his desk, the sound of that laughter still echoing in his mind, he realized the danger was far greater than he had imagined. Elena wasn't just healing his daughter. She was infiltrating the fortress of his own heart. And in his world, a man with a soft heart was a man who was already dead. He poured a glass of whiskey, his hand trembling slightly, and looked at the security monitors. He saw them on the screen, the doctor and the girl, surrounded by the wreckage of their art. He knew he should send her away, but as he watched Min-ho reach out and timidly put a smudge of blue paint on Elena's cheek, he knew he never would. The first spark had been lit, and while it brought light to the nursery, it also cast long, dangerous shadows. Kang-dae knew his enemies were watching. They would see his daughter's laughter as a weakness. They would see Elena as his Achilles heel. As he watched the screen, the Mafia Boss realized that he had just given his enemies a target, and he had never felt more prepared to burn the world down to protect it. The transition from the vibrant, paint-splattered joy of the nursery to the cold, clinical reality of her medical responsibilities was always a jarring descent for Elena. Even as Min-ho's laughter echoed in the back of her mind like a precious melody, the weight of the golden cage remained. Elena stood in the auxiliary medical storage room, a windowless chamber tucked deep within the stone bones of the mansion's lower levels. It was a space designed for efficiency. Rows of stainless steel shelving stocked with everything from basic sutures to advanced cardiac stimulants. Kang-dae had spared no expense, ensuring that his daughter's sanctuary was also a fully functional trauma center. Elena moved methodically, her fingers tracing the labels on the glass vials as she performed her weekly inventory. The air in the room was recirculated and chilled, carrying a faint metallic tang that always made the hair on her arms stand up. She reached for a crate of specialized pediatric 4 kits, her mind wandering to the progress Min-ho had made. The child was no longer a ghost. She was becoming a girl again, a messy, giggling, curious being. But as Elena leaned back to reach a higher shelf, a sound caught her ear. A sharp, sibilant hiss that didn't belong to the hum of the ventilation system. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The sound was coming from the air duct directly above the shelving unit. The mansion was an architectural masterpiece, but its bones were ancient, and the ventilation shafts acted like a series of copper whispering galleries, carrying sound from the high-security meeting rooms above down to the utility corridors. "The Ice King is melting," a voice drifted through the grate. It was a gravelly, low-pitched rasp, thick with the dialect of the Seoul underworld. Elena recognized it instantly as Captain Choi, one of Kang-dae's oldest lieutenants, a man who had stood at the boss's right hand for a decade. He spends more time watching the nursery monitors than the shipping manifests. He's distracted, weak. "It's the doctor," another voice replied. This one smoother, younger, and dripping with venom. It was Park, the head of the perimeter security detail. She's a contagion. She's turned a fortress into a playground. Ever since she arrived, Kangdae has forgotten who we are. He thinks he can be a father and a king at the same time. He's forgotten that in this world, a crown is held by blood, not by finger paints. Elena's heart began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stayed perfectly still, her hands still resting on a box of bandages, afraid that even the rustle of her lab coat would betray her presence. Tonight's the cleaning then? Choi asked, the word landing with the weight of a death sentence. Midnight, Park confirmed. The shift change at the north gate is already handled. My men are positioned. We'll sweep the home office first. By the time the loyalists realize the perimeter is breached, the House of Kong will have a new master. We'll take the boss out cleanly. No mess, no lingering questions. There was a brief, chilling silence before Choi spoke again. His voice lower, more predatory. And the girl? And the foreigner? Collateral damage, Park dismissed casually, as if he were discussing clearing out old furniture. We can't have a silent heiress becoming a rallying point for the old guard. And the doctor knows too much of the layout. Once the king is dead, the nursery goes dark. We'll make it look like a rival syndicate strike. A tragic end to a tragic family. The sound of footsteps moving away from the vent grate signaled the end of the conversation, but the silence that followed was far more terrifying. Elena slumped against the cold steel of the shelving unit, her legs trembling so violently she feared she would collapse. The serpent's hiss had laid bare the rot at the heart of the mansion. The very men tasked with guarding the golden cage were the ones preparing to turn it into a tomb. Elena looked at her watch. It was 9:45 p.m. She had a little over 2 hours before the shadows of the mansion turned into executioners. Her first instinct was to run, to grab Minho and flee through the iron gates. But she realized with a cold jolt of clarity that the gates were controlled by Park's men. Every security camera she passed, every guard who nodded to her in the hallway, was now a potential threat. The perimeter was no longer a shield. It was a noose. She moved out of the storage room, her movements stiff and mechanical as she forced herself to maintain the appearance of a doctor finishing her rounds. Her mind was a whirlwind of strategic panic. She couldn't call the police. The Kong Syndicate's influence ran too deep, and any outside interference would likely trigger the cleaning early. She couldn't tell the other captains. She didn't know who else was involved in the coup. There was only one man who could stop this, but reaching him was the ultimate risk. Kangdae was currently behind the heavy, reinforced mahogany doors of his home office, conducting a high-table meeting with the heads of his legitimate business arms. According to the strict protocols of the estate, Elena was never permitted to interrupt a business session. The guards outside his door were instructed to use force to maintain his privacy. As she ascended the stairs toward the nursery, Elena passed a window overlooking the courtyard. She saw the guards stationed there. Men she had smiled at, men who had helped her carry medical crates. Now, she saw the way they adjusted their holsters, the way they checked their synchronized watches. They were no longer protectors. They were vultures waiting for the clock to strike 12. She burst into the nursery, finding Minho tucked into bed, the small girl's face peaceful in sleep, her hands still clutching the sketchbook they had worked on earlier. Elena felt a surge of protective fury that drowned out her fear. She realized that she wasn't just a doctor anymore. She was the only person in this fortress who truly cared if this child lived to see the sunrise. She began to move with a desperate, clinical precision. She didn't pack clothes or toys. Instead, she went to her medical bag and grabbed a heavy-duty sedative, a portable heart monitor, and a large, sterile syringe. If she was going to get past the guards and into that office, she couldn't go as a messenger of doom. She had to go as a physician facing a crisis. She checked the hallway. It was empty, but she knew the sensors were active. She had to make this look like a medical emergency, a critical interaction that superseded every other protocol. She thought of the medical ruse strategy. She knew that the guards, for all their violence, feared one thing above all else: being blamed for the boss's death due to negligence. Elena took a deep breath, smoothing her lab coat and tucking her hair back. She looked at herself in the mirror. her dark skin pale with tension, her eyes wide. She forced her breathing to slow, adopting the calm, authoritative mask of a surgeon about to enter an operating theater. She wasn't just Dr. Elena anymore. She was the woman who had brought the Mafia Boss's daughter back to life. And tonight, she was going to do the same for the father. As she stepped out into the hall, the air felt electric, charged with the impending violence of the midnight cleaning. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, every creak of the floorboards sounding like a gunshot. She headed toward the wing that housed the boss's private office, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the golden cage. The serpent had hissed, and the venom was spreading through the house, but Elena knew that the only way to survive the bite was to strike first. She reached the final corridor leading to the heavy mahogany doors. 2 guards stood there, their faces obscured by the dim lighting, their hands resting visibly on their weapons. They stepped forward as she approached, their movements synchronized and cold. This was the moment of no return. If she failed here, the cleaning would proceed, and by morning, the House of Kong would be a memory. Elena gripped the medical bag in her hand, her gaze narrowing. "Step aside," she commanded, her voice cutting through the tension with a sharp, professional edge. "There's a critical anomaly in the boss's vitals, and if I don't get in there now, none of you will have a boss to guard by midnight." The guards hesitated, the first crack in their resolve appearing as they looked at the medical bag and the fierce, unwavering determination in the eyes of the doctor. The clock was ticking, and the serpent was coiled, ready to strike, but Elena was already moving, her heart set on the man behind the door and the war that was about to break out in the heart of the golden cage. The hallway leading to the inner sanctum of the Kong estate had never felt so long. The air was unnervingly cold, carrying the faint, recycled scent of expensive floor wax and the metallic tang of concealed firearms. Elena's heels clicked against the polished obsidian floor, a rhythmic, frantic sound that felt like a countdown. In her right hand, she gripped a stainless steel medical tray. In her left, she clutched a heavy-duty cardiac syringe filled with a harmless saline solution, though to any layman, it looked like a shot of pure adrenaline. As she rounded the final corner, the 2 high-table sentries moved with mechanical synchronization, their bodies forming a wall of dark wool and muscle in front of the massive mahogany doors. These were Park's men, the very serpents she had heard whispering in the vents. She could see the slight bulge of their synchronized tactical watches, ticking toward the midnight cleaning. To them, she was just the help, a captured doctor who spent her days painting with a silent child. They didn't see the woman who had survived the gangland ERs of Chicago. They didn't see the predator hidden behind the white coat. "The boss is in a closed session, doctor," the guard on the left stated, his voice a flat, dead rasp. He didn't move his hand from his holster. "No interruptions. No exceptions." Elena didn't slow down. She increased her pace, her breathing ragged and shallow, mimicking a state of high-alert panic. She allowed a sheen of sweat to break on her forehead, her dark eyes wide and wild with a feigned medical terror. "Get out of my way," she snapped, her voice cracking with an authority that stopped the guard's hand mid-motion. "I just received the automated lab results from his morning screening. The toxicology report is a nightmare. There is a lethal level of digitalis-type toxin in his system, likely a slow-release agent. If his heart rate spikes during this meeting, he'll be into full cardiac arrest before he hits the floor." The guards exchanged a lightning-fast look of confusion. They were trained to handle bullets and blades, not biology. The mention of a toxin hit them like a physical blow. If the boss died of a medical anomaly on their watch before the cleaning was officially sanctioned, they would be the first ones executed for incompetence by the rest of the syndicate. "We haven't seen any signs," the second guard started, but Elena cut him off, thrusting the heart monitor toward his face. The screen was flashing a pre-programmed red alert. "Because he's a high-functioning hypertensive," she yelled, her voice echoing in the silent corridor. "He won't feel it until his lungs fill with fluid. Move, or you can explain to the rest of the captains why you let the king die because of a closed session. If he stops breathing in the next 5 minutes, his blood is on your hands." Fear, the great equalizer, did the work. The guard on the right fumbled with the biometric scanner, his fingers trembling. The heavy mahogany doors hissed open, revealing a room that looked like a temple to power and shadows. The air inside the office was thick with the smell of old paper and bitter tea. A dozen men sat around a long, rectangular table made of ancient wood, their faces hard and unreadable. At the head of the table sat Kangdae. He looked like a god of war in a tailored suit, a porcelain teacup held delicately in his large, scarred hand. He didn't look surprised by the intrusion. He looked annoyed, his obsidian eyes narrowing as they locked onto Elena. "Doctor," he said, the word a low, dangerous warning. "I believe I made the protocols regarding this room very clear." Elena didn't apologize. She didn't even look at the other men, several of whom had already shifted in their seats to reach for concealed weapons. She marched straight to the head of the table, the guards hovering at the door, paralyzed by the medical emergency she had fabricated. "Put the tea down, Kangdae," she commanded, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, yet laced with a tremor that suggested professional urgency. She reached him before he could speak again. She set the medical tray down on the table with a sharp clatter, effectively knocking over his saucer. The amber liquid spilled across the dark wood like a spreading stain. Elena leaned over him, her body shielding his view from the rest of the room. She pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point on his neck, her face inches from his. To the observers, she was a dedicated physician checking a dying man's vitals. But as she felt the steady, powerful thrum of his carotid artery against her fingertips, she leaned in until her lips almost brushed his ear. "Don't react," she whispered, the words so soft they were almost a breath. "Your tea is poisoned, and the guards at your door are the venom. Choi and Park are leading a cleaning at midnight. The perimeter is already compromised. If you don't follow my lead and act like you're having a seizure right now, neither of us, and certainly not Min-ho, leaves this house alive." For a heartbeat, the man beneath her fingers went entirely still. The heat radiating from his body was intense, and for a second, Elena feared he would reject her warning and simply kill everyone in the room. But Kangdae was a man who had survived a decade of treachery. He felt the genuine, cold terror in Elena's touch. He saw the way her eyes were darting toward the guards. Without a word, Kangdae's hand spasmed. The teacup shattered against the floor, a sharp explosion of porcelain in the quiet room. He let out a choked, guttural groan, his body slumping back into the heavy leather chair. "He's crashing," Elena screamed, turning toward the room. She grabbed the syringe, her hands moving with a practiced, violent speed. "Clear the table. I need space. He's in respiratory distress." The room erupted into chaos. The high table captains stood up, some in genuine shock, others, like Choi, who sat at the far end, with a look of calculating suspicion. The 2 guards at the door rushed forward, their eyes fixed on the dying boss. "Get back!" Elena roared at them, her voice filled with a fierce, maternal rage. She pointed the needle at the nearest guard as if it were a weapon. "He needs oxygen, not a firing squad. Choi, get the emergency kit from the hallway. Now!" In the confusion, Elena leaned over Kangdae again, her hair falling like a curtain around them. He was perfectly still, his eyes rolled back, playing the part with terrifying accuracy. "The safe room in the nursery," she whispered. "I've already prepared it. We have 10 minutes before they realize the toxin story is a lie." Kangdae's hand reached out, hidden by the table, and gripped Elena's wrist. His grip was like a vice, not out of aggression but out of a sudden, desperate alignment. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a father who had just been told his house was on fire. "The north elevator," he breathed back, his voice a ghost of a sound. "Go!" Suddenly, the heavy silence of the room was broken not by a voice, but by a sound that made every man in the room freeze. It was the synchronized chirp of 12 high-frequency tactical tablets. Elena felt the air leave the room. Kangdae's eyes snapped open, his cover blown by the sheer urgency of the moment. He sat up, his gaze fixing on his own tablet, which lay face up on the spilled tea. A single message sat on the glowing screen, sent from an untraceable, encrypted source outside the mansion's firewall. It wasn't a tactical update or a demand for ransom. It was a declaration of war. Asterisk, the Ice King has stayed in the sun too long. The Glass Dynasty is shattered. The war has just begun. Asterisk. Elena looked at Kangdae, her heart stopping. The midnight cleaning wasn't just an internal coup. It was the opening bell of a massacre. The guards at the door drew their weapons, their faces shifting from confusion to lethal intent. They didn't care about the toxin anymore. The order had been given. Kangdae didn't hesitate. He grabbed Elena by the waist, pulling her behind the reinforced oak desk just as the first volley of gunfire shattered the expensive glass decanters on the sideboard. "Welcome to the family, Doctor," Kangdae growled, pulling a sleek, matte black handgun from a hidden holster beneath the table. The medical ruse was over. The golden cage was officially under siege. As the wood of the desk splintered above their heads, Elena realized that she had walked into the meeting to save one man, but she had ended up starting a revolution. The war wasn't coming anymore. It was here, and the only way out was through the blood. The mahogany desk splintered under a rhythmic hail of lead, the fine wood dust hanging in the air like a cursed mist. Elena crouched in the cramped footwell, her heart hammering against her ribs with such violence she feared it would bruise her chest. The transition from doctor to human shield had happened in the heartbeat it took for Kangdae to pull her down. Above them, the office had transformed into a kill zone. The shouting of men, the shattering of priceless porcelain, and the deafening, percussive cracks of handguns created a symphony of chaos that made the clinical silence of the hospital feel like a dream from another life. "The north elevator," Kangdae hissed, his voice remarkably steady despite the carnage. He fired 2 precise shots over the edge of the desk, the recoil rattling the heavy furniture. "The service override code is 0804. That's Minho's birthday. Elena, look at me." She turned her head, her dark skin glistening with the sweat of pure, unadulterated terror. Kangdae's obsidian eyes weren't cold anymore. They were burning with a desperate, singular focus. He reached out, his large hand cupping the back of her neck for a fraction of a second, grounding her in the middle of the storm. "Get to her," he commanded. "If the perimeter is breached, they'll go for the nursery to finish the bloodline. You are the only one they won't expect to be armed with a plan. Go now, or we both die in this office." Elena didn't wait for a second invitation. As Kangdae stood to provide a wall of suppressive fire, she bolted. She stayed low, her lab coat fluttering behind her like a tattered flag of truce that no one was honoring. She scrambled toward the hidden service door behind the heavy velvet curtains, the scent of gunpowder stinging her nostrils and sticking to the back of her throat. She didn't look back at the man who was currently taking on his own inner circle to buy her 10 seconds of life. The service elevator was a cramped, utilitarian box of brushed steel. She punched in the code, 0804, and felt the jolt of the motor as it bypassed the main security floor. The silence inside the elevator was deafening, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in the dust of the desk and a smear of Kangdae's blood from when he'd pulled her down. She wasn't a surgeon anymore. She was a woman in a war. When the doors hissed open on the nursery floor, the golden cage had become a labyrinth of shadows. The emergency red lights were pulsing, casting a rhythmic, bloody glow over the hallways. Elena ran, her heels skidding on the polished floors. She reached the nursery doors and burst inside, her eyes searching the dim room for the small, fragile girl who would become the center of her world. Minho was huddled in the corner of her oversized bed, her hands clamped over her ears, her eyes wide and glassy with a familiar, haunting catatonia. The sounds of the battle below, the muffled explosions and the distant screams, were vibrating through the floorboards. The trauma was flooding back, a dark tide rising to swallow the progress they had made with paint and music.
Minho.
"Minho, it's me." Elena scooped the child up, the girl's body as rigid as a statue. She didn't have time for a gentle approach. The sounds of heavy boots were echoing in the hallway now. Park's men were coming to clean the nursery. Elena carried Minho toward the back of the walk-in closet, where a reinforced steel panel was hidden behind a row of silk dresses. It was a safe room, a pressurized vault designed for exactly this nightmare. She hit the manual release, shoved Minho inside, and followed, the heavy door thudding shut with a sound of absolute finality. Inside, the vault was silent, save for the hum of the independent air filtration system. There were monitors on the wall showing grainy, night vision feeds of the nursery. Elena slumped against the door, her lungs burning. She looked at Min-ho, who was curled into a ball on the floor, her chest heaving in silent, jagged hitches. "We're safe, baby. We're safe," Elena whispered, reaching out to pull the girl into her lap. But they weren't safe. On the monitor, the nursery door was kicked open. Two men in tactical gear entered, their suppressed submachine guns sweeping the room. They moved with a terrifying, professional lethality. One of them headed straight for the closet. He didn't know about the safe room, but he knew the girl was missing. He began to spray the closet with bullets, the muffled thud-thud-thud of the rounds, hitting the reinforced exterior of the vault sounding like hammers against a coffin. Min-ho's eyes locked onto the screen. She saw the men destroying her sanctuary, the shadows of the world she had tried to hide from finally tearing through the walls. The vibration of the bullets hitting the door was a physical assault. Elena pulled Min-ho tighter, shielding the girl's head with her own body. "Don't look, Min-ho. Close your eyes. I'm here. I've got you." The man on the screen moved closer to the hidden panel, his gloved hand reaching for the latch he had finally spotted. He pulled a small explosive charge from his vest. He was going to blow the door. The trauma in Min-ho's chest, the 2 years of frozen grief and silent terror, suddenly hit a breaking point. It wasn't a slow thaw. It was a volcanic eruption. The silence that had been her shield for 700 days shattered into a million jagged pieces. As the soldier placed the charge against the steel, Min-ho's mouth opened. A sound tore out of her. Not a sob, not a whimper, but a raw, piercing scream that vibrated through Elena's very bones. It was a word. It was a plea. It was a command. "Elena." The name echoed in the small vault, louder than the gunfire, more powerful than the explosives. The silent heiress had found her voice, and she had used it to call for the woman who had walked into the mouth of the lion to find her. The shock of the sound made Elena gasp. She looked down at Min-ho, whose eyes were no longer glassy. They were sharp, focused, and filled with a fierce, burning intelligence. The child wasn't hiding anymore. She was fighting. The explosive charge outside detonated, but the safe room held. The shockwave rattled the monitors, but the steel didn't buckle. On the screen, the soldier was thrown back by his own miscalculation, the heavy furniture of the nursery collapsing on top of him. But Elena didn't care about the soldier. She was staring at the little girl in her arms. Min-ho reached up, her small, trembling hand cupping Elena's face. Her lips moved again, the voice raspy from years of disuse, but steady. "Elena." "Stay. I'm not going anywhere," Elena choked out, tears finally streaming down her face, hot and fast. She pulled the child into a crushing embrace. In that moment, the bond was no longer a professional contract or a golden cage assignment. It was sealed in the fire of the coup and the blood of the House of Kong. Elena realized that by giving Min-ho her voice back in the middle of a massacre, she had done something far more dangerous than healing a patient. She had created a reason for the Mafia Boss to burn the rest of the world to the ground. Through the internal speakers of the safe room, a new sound began to override the gunfire. It was the heavy, rhythmic thrum of Black Hawk helicopters and the tactical shouting of the Kong loyalists, the Ice King's true army, finally arriving to reclaim the throne. But inside the vault, the only sound that mattered was the steady, rhythmic breathing of a child who had finally decided to come home. The war had just begun, but the silence was over. Elena held the girl as the world outside tore itself apart, knowing that whatever happened next, they were no longer just a doctor and a patient. They were the architects of a new dynasty, and the first word of their reign had just been spoken. The monitors flickered, showing the nursery being reclaimed by men in familiar black suits. But Elena didn't let go. She felt the weight of the girl's trust, a weight heavier than the steel doors protecting them. Min-ho had chosen her again, not with a grip on a lab coat, but with a scream in the dark. And as the sounds of victory began to replace the sounds of betrayal, Elena knew that her 3-month contract had just become a life sentence. one she was no longer sure she wanted to escape. The scent of gunpowder had long since been scrubbed from the marble floors of the Kong estate, replaced by the clinical, sharp aroma of high-grade disinfectant and the faint, sweet smell of the jasmine tea Elena favored. Life in the golden cage had returned to a semblance of order, but it was an order fundamentally altered by the fire they had walked through together. The silence that once defined the mansion was dead. In its place was the melodic, slightly raspy chatter of a 6-year-old girl who seemed determined to make up for 700 days of lost time. Min-ho was speaking, not just in whispers, but in full, vibrant sentences that filled the breakfast room and echoed in the corridors where shadows used to hide. Elena sat at the polished mahogany table, her fingers tracing the rim of her porcelain cup as she watched Min-ho describe a drawing of a butterfly. The child's voice was a miracle, a medical impossibility made real by sheer emotional necessity. But as Elena listened, her gaze drifted to the heavy leather folder resting at the far end of the table. Inside were the documents that represented the finality of their agreement, the transfer of significant shares in the Seoul International Medical Center, and the legal dissolution of her 24/7 personal physician contract. It was her freedom, printed on high bond paper and waiting for a single drop of ink. Kang-dae sat opposite her, his face a mask of brooding intensity that even the morning sun couldn't soften. He looked different since the night of the cleaning. The cold, untouchable aura of the Mafia Boss had been replaced by something more grounded, more human, and infinitely more dangerous. He watched Elena with a predatory stillness, his eyes tracking the way the light hit her dark skin and the tired, triumphant curve of her smile. He had survived the coup, purged his inner circle, and reclaimed his throne, but he was currently losing a war against a piece of paper. "The paperwork is complete," Kang-dae said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor the air in the room. He didn't reach for the folder. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks, his movements slow and deliberate. "My legal team has finalized the equity transfer. You will walk back into that hospital not as an employee, but as an owner. You will have the autonomy you craved. You will have your life back." Elena looked at him, her heart performing a strange, fluttering rhythm that she couldn't categorize as clinical. "That was the deal, Mr. Kong. 3 months. Min-ho speaks, and I go back to my world. Is that what you want?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Elena glanced at Min-ho, who was now humming a tune Elena had taught her during their music therapy. The thought of leaving the girl, of returning to a quiet apartment and a hospital wing where the stakes were merely medical, felt like a phantom limb pain. She had become the anchor for a child who had once been adrift in a sea of silence. But more than that, she had become a witness to the man behind the monster. She had seen Kang-dae bleed. She had seen him shield her with his own body while the world turned to lead and fire. "It's what the contract says," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the internal storm. Kang-dae finally reached for the folder, but he didn't open it. He tapped his fingers against the leather, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested a deep internal calculation. "There is a discrepancy in the secondary clauses," he lied, the falsehood rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "The insurance riders for the hospital's pediatric wing haven't been synchronized with the new board structure. It would be unwise to sign until the audit is finalized. Perhaps another week." Elena narrowed her eyes. She was a surgeon. She knew when someone was stalling a procedure. "The audit was finished 4 days ago, Kang-dae. I saw the digital confirmation on the internal server." He didn't flinch. He simply leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. "Servers can be hacked. My security team is performing a deep sweep of all financial assets linked to the coup conspirators. Until I am certain that your shares are untainted by dirty capital, I cannot in good conscience let you sign. I am protecting your interests, Doctor." "You're protecting your house?" Elena countered, her voice dropping to a whisper so Min-ho wouldn't hear. "You're finding excuses to keep me in this cage, even if the bars are made of gold and hospital shares." Kang-dae leaned forward, the shadows of the room seeming to gather around him. The Ice King was gone, replaced by a man who had realized that his greatest asset wasn't his territory or his soldiers. It was the woman sitting across from him. During the assassination attempt, He had felt a fear he hadn't known since his wife's death. But it hadn't been for himself. It had been for Elena. He had realized that her presence in his life wasn't just a medical necessity for his daughter. It was a spiritual necessity for him. She was the only person who looked at him without fear, who challenged him, who healed the wounds he didn't even know he had. "I am protecting the woman who saved us both," he said, his voice raw with a sudden, startling honesty. He reached across the table, his hand stopping just inches from hers, an uncharacteristic hesitation from a man who usually took whatever he wanted. "My daughter has her voice because of you, but I have found something I thought was dead. The perimeter is still weak, Elena. The stepsister's reach is longer than I anticipated. If you leave this house, you become a target. As a shareholder of my hospital, you are linked to me. Out there, you are vulnerable. Here, you are mine to defend. I was never supposed to be yours to defend," Elena whispered, her fingers trembling. "I was a doctor with a 3-month assignment. The assignment changed the moment you whispered in my ear while a dozen guns were pointed at my head," Kangdae said. He finally let his hand cover hers, his palm warm and calloused, a heavy weight that felt like a promise and a shackle all at once. "You didn't just save a life that night. You chose a side. And in my world, once you choose a side, there is no going back to the neutral ground." Elena looked down at their joined hands. She should have pulled away. She should have demanded the pen and walked out the iron gates toward her old life. But as she looked up and caught Minho watching them with a knowing, hopeful sparkle in her eyes, she realized the hospital stake wasn't just a financial arrangement. It was a tether. Kangdae wasn't just delaying the paperwork. He was building a wall around her, not to keep her prisoner, but to ensure that he never had to breathe in a world without her again. The contract lay between them, a dead thing made of ink and paper, while the air in the room hummed with a living, breathing tension. Elena realized that she was no longer just a doctor in a golden cage. She was a woman standing at the edge of a dynasty, and the man holding her hand was the king who was refusing to let her fall. The war wasn't over. The message on the tablet had made that clear, but as Kangdae pushed the folder aside, effectively burying her freedom under a mountain of administrative delays, Elena felt a strange, terrifying sense of relief. She wasn't ready to leave the girl who had screamed her name in the dark. And as she looked into the obsidian depths of Kangdae's eyes, she realized she wasn't ready to leave the man who had burned his own world to keep her safe. The hospital stake was signed in their hearts long before the ink would ever touch the page. The morning mist clung to the jagged cliffs of the valley like a shroud, mirroring the heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside the mansion. It was the 91st day. According to the digital clock on Elena's nightstand, her tenure in the House of Kong had officially reached its expiration. The freedom contract, as she had begun to call it in the quiet hours of the night, was no longer a theoretical promise. It sat on the polished obsidian desk in Kangdae's primary study, the fountain pen resting beside it like a loaded weapon. The shares in the hospital were hers. The legal immunity was drafted. The bulletproof sedan was fueled and waiting at the south gate to take her back to her apartment in the city. Elena stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the nursery, her hands tucked into the pockets of a cardigan that felt too thin for the chill settling into her bones. Behind her, the room was packed. Her medical crates were sealed, her books were boxed, and the vibrant, paint-splattered butcher paper that had once covered the floor had been rolled up and removed. The room looked like a museum again, perfect, sterile, and devoid of the messy, beautiful life they had built over the last 12 weeks. She heard the soft click of the door and didn't need to turn to know it was Minho. The child's footsteps, once light and hesitant, had become confident and rhythmic over the months. But today they were slow, dragging. Elena turned, a practiced smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, sunshine," Elena said, her voice sounding brittle in the quiet room. "I made sure your favorite markers are in the top drawer of the new desk your father bought. And I wrote down the instructions for the new physical therapist. She's very kind, Minho. You'll like her." Minho didn't answer. She stood in the doorway, wearing the yellow dress Elena had picked out for her a week ago. Her dark eyes, which had become so expressive and bright, were now flat, opaque pools of obsidian. She looked at the packed boxes, then at the empty space where Elena's record player used to sit. Finally, her gaze moved to Elena's face.
Minho?
Elena knelt, reaching out to brush a stray hair from the girl's forehead. The child didn't flinch, but she didn't lean into the touch either. She simply closed her mouth, her lips pressing together into a thin, white line. It was a gesture Elena recognized, but the context had shifted. This wasn't the catatonic lock of a traumatized victim. This was the iron-willed defiance of a girl who had learned that her silence was the only thing the most powerful man in Seoul couldn't break. We talked about this, remember? Elena's heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. I have to go back to the hospital. There are other children who need me, but I'll visit. Your father promised I could come every Sunday. Minho didn't blink. She turned around, walked to her bed, and sat down with her back to Elena. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply retreated into the fortress of her own mind, pulling the drawbridge up behind her. The silent strike had begun. For the next 4 hours, the mansion became a pressure cooker of unspoken grief. Kangdae arrived in the nursery an hour later, his face a storm of suppressed fury and desperation. He had tried to coax a word out of his daughter, a goodbye, a don't go, anything. But Minho had looked through him as if he were made of glass. She refused to eat. She refused to move. She wouldn't even look at the sketchbook that had been their shared sanctuary. She's doing this on purpose? Kangdae growled, stepping out onto the balcony with Elena. He gripped the stone railing so hard his knuckles turned white. This isn't the trauma, Elena. This is a siege. She knows that if she stops speaking, you won't be able to walk through those gates. I can't stay because of a protest, Kangdae, Elena whispered, though her resolve was crumbling like dry sand. That's not medicine. That's an emotional hostage situation. She has to learn that people leave, but that doesn't mean they stop loving her. And who is going to teach her that? Kangdae turned, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying intensity. The new therapist? The guards? Me? I am a man who deals in finalities. Elena, when people leave my life, they are usually in a casket. You are the only person who has ever walked into this house and brought something back to life. You think she's just being stubborn? She's fighting for her soul. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, smelling of cold rain and the expensive tobacco he smoked when he was agitated. The contract is on the desk. Sign it and go. The car is waiting. I won't stop you. I am a man of my word. Then why do you look like you're about to burn the world down? Elena challenged, her own eyes filling with tears. Because I am, he replied, his voice a low, jagged rasp. If you leave, and she stays silent, I will lose her again. And this time I won't have the strength to find her. And I will lose you. The woman who told me my tea was poisoned while guns were at her head. The only woman who wasn't afraid to stick her tongue out at the king of Seoul. He reached out, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw, a gesture so tender it felt more violent than a blow. Go, Elena. Take your freedom. It's what you wanted. Elena walked back into the nursery to say one last goodbye. Minho hadn't moved. She was still sitting on the edge of the bed, a small, yellow-clad statue of grief. Elena sat beside her, the weight of the freedom contract feeling like lead in her mind. I love you, Minho, Elena said, her voice breaking. You gave me a voice too, you know. I was just a doctor going through the motions until I met you. You reminded me why I do this. Minho finally turned her head. She didn't speak, but she reached out and grabbed the sleeve of Elena's cardigan, her small fingers twisting into the wool. It was the same grip from the hospital hallway 3 months ago. It was a plea for a mother, not a physician. It was a choice of family over freedom. Elena looked toward the door and saw Kangdae standing there, watching them. He held the freedom contract in his hand. He didn't say a word, but he slowly tore the paper in half, then again, until the fragments of her old life fluttered to the obsidian floor like snow. He didn't do it to trap her. He did it because he knew the choice had already been made in the silence of the room. Elena didn't protest. She didn't demand a new copy. She simply reached out and pulled Minho into her lap, burying her face in the girl's hair. Okay, Elena whispered into the quiet. Okay.
I'm staying.
Minho didn't speak immediately. She waited, her small heart thudding against Elena's chest. Then, she let out a long, shuddering breath. She leaned back, looked Elena in the eye, and spoke the first words of her new life. Words that weren't born of trauma, but of a deep, ancient recognition. Thank you,
Mama.
The word hit the room like a lightning strike. Kangdae closed his eyes, his head bowing as a single, ragged breath escaped him. The choice of freedom had been made, and Elena realized that she had traded her independence for something much more dangerous and much more beautiful. She was no longer a doctor on a contract. She was the heart of a dynasty, the mother to a silent heiress who had finally found her power, and the woman to a man who would burn the heavens to keep her by his side. The iron gates of the estate remained closed that day, and as the mist cleared from the valley, Elena knew that the war was far from over. But as she held the girl and looked at the man in the doorway, she realized she wasn't a prisoner in a golden cage anymore. She was the one who held the key. The transition from the golden cage to the throne of a dynasty did not happen with a fanfare of trumpets, but with the quiet, chilling precision of a clinical operation. Elena stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her private suite, her reflection unrecognizable from the woman who had walked into the Seoul International Medical Center 3 months ago. The white lab coat was gone, replaced by a gown of midnight silk that clung to her like a second skin, its deep hue a stark, elegant contrast against the warmth of her dark skin. Diamonds, cold and brilliant, circled her throat, a gift from Kangdae that felt less like jewelry and more like a declaration of war. She was no longer a doctor defined by her independence. She was a woman defined by her choice. The freedom contract lay in ashes on the floor of the nursery, and in its place was a new reality. She had spent years healing bodies, suturing wounds, and fighting for lives in the sterile light of an operating room. Now, she was preparing to step into a different kind of theater, one where the wounds were structural, the enemies were familial, and the stakes were the survival of the only family she had ever truly claimed as her own. A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of Kangdae. He didn't look like a mafia boss tonight, he looked like a monarch. His tuxedo was tailored to a lethal edge, his presence so commanding it seemed to pull the very air toward him. He walked up behind her, his large, scarred hands resting gently on her shoulders. For a moment, they simply stared at their combined reflection. The Black Doctor from Chicago and the king of the Seoul underworld, an impossible union forged in gunfire and sealed by the voice of a child. The gala is waiting, Kangdae said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. The elite of this city, the politicians, the rivals, the snakes in silk, they are all there to see if the Ice King has truly melted. They think that because I found a heart, I have found a weakness. Elena turned in his arms, her gaze unwavering. Let them think that. Weakness is only a matter of perspective. Kangdae's expression softened, a rare, vulnerable shadow crossing his obsidian eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a signet ring, heavy gold engraved with the crest of the Kang dynasty, but modified. A small, subtle caduceus was etched into the side of the band. I told you I wouldn't stop you from leaving, he whispered. But I never said I wouldn't give you a reason to stay. I don't want a personal physician, Elena. I don't want a captive in a cage. I want a partner. Someone to stand beside me while I rebuild this empire into something Minho can actually inherit without fear. I want a matriarch. Elena looked at the ring, then at the man who had burned his own inner circle to keep her safe. She realized that her old life of independence had been a different kind of cage, one of isolation and emotional distance. Here, in the heart of the storm, she had found a purpose that transcended medicine. She reached out and took the ring, sliding it onto her finger. The weight of it was a vow. Then let's show them what a dynasty looks like, she said. The drive to the Grand Hyatt was conducted in a motorcade that resembled a military deployment. 10 black SUVs, windows tinted to an impenetrable black, carved a path through the neon-lit streets of Seoul. Inside the lead car, Minho sat between them, her small hand tucked firmly into Elena's. The child was no longer silent. She was humming a soft tune, her eyes bright with the excitement of her first public appearance. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the heir. As they arrived, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi created a rhythmic, blinding strobe light. The red carpet was lined with the most powerful people in the country, all of whom went silent as the door to the lead car opened. Kangdae stepped out first, offering his hand to Elena. When she emerged, the collective intake of breath from the crowd was audible. The rumors had been circulating for weeks about the foreign doctor who had captured the boss's heart, but the reality was far more intimidating. Elena didn't walk with the hesitancy of a consort. She walked with the predatory grace of a queen. They entered the ballroom as a single unit: Kangdae, Elena, and Minho. It was a signal to every enemy in the room. The boss was no longer alone. He had a heart, he had a voice, and he had a protector who knew exactly where to strike to make it hurt. But the true theater began in the private VIP lounge an hour later. Kangdae's intelligence team had spent the last 48 hours tracing the encrypted message from the night of the coup. The trail hadn't led to a rival syndicate or a foreign entity. It had led back to the family tree. As the heavy doors to the lounge closed, sealing out the music of the gala, a woman sat in a velvet armchair, sipping a glass of vintage champagne. She was elegant, her features a sharper, colder version of Kangdae's own. It was Ji-won, Kangdae's stepsister, the woman who had managed the syndicate's European finances for a decade. "Brother," Ji-won said, her voice like ice water. She didn't stand. She looked at Elena with a sneer of pure, aristocratic disdain. "I see you've brought your medical curiosity to the party. I must admit, I didn't think a common surgeon would have the stomach for our world." Kangdae moved to stand in front of Elena, his hand moving toward the holster beneath his jacket. But Elena placed a firm hand on his arm. She stepped forward, bypassing the king to face the serpent. "The investigation is complete, G1, Elena said, her voice dropping into the low, clinical tone she used when delivering a terminal diagnosis. "We traced the wire transfers to the mercenary groups. We traced the cleaning order back to a server in Geneva registered in your name. You didn't just want the throne. You wanted to erase the only things Kangdae loves." Ji-won laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "This is a family matter, doctor. You are an interloper, a temporary distraction. My brother is soft, and his daughter is a broken doll. I was simply doing what was necessary to preserve the strength of the Kang name." Elena walked closer until she was standing directly over the seated woman. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The guards at the door straightened, sensing the change in the air. Elena leaned down, her face inches from Ji-won's. The diamonds at her neck caught the light, but it was the cold, lethal fire in her eyes that made the stepsister's smile falter. "You're wrong about 3 things," Elena whispered, the words dripping with a cold, focused fury. "First, Kangdae isn't soft, he's focused. Second, Minho isn't broken. She's found her voice, and she used it to tell me exactly how much you scared her. And third, you think I'm just a doctor." Elena reached out, her fingers brushing the lapel of Ji-won's expensive blazer, her touch light but possessive. "In my world, as a surgeon, I spent my life fighting to save every heartbeat. But a doctor also knows when a limb is gangrenous. We know when a tumor is too deep to be treated with medicine. We know when the only way to save the body is to cut the sickness out." Ji-won tried to stand, but the weight of Elena's gaze seemed to pin her to the chair. The stepsister's hand trembled, her champagne glass rattling against her ring. "You went after the man I love," Elena continued, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. "But more importantly, you traumatized his daughter. You took 2 years of her life and tried to turn her back into a ghost. In my world, we don't just clean enemies, Ji-won. We don't leave them as martyrs or stories. We erase them. We remove every trace of their influence, every scent of their wealth, and every memory of their existence until it's as if they were never born." Elena straightened up, looking back at Kangdae, who was watching her with a look of pure, dark adoration. The Ice King had found his match. A woman who could heal a child and execute a traitor without blinking. "The war isn't over," Elena said, turning back to Ji-won, whose face had gone a sickly shade of gray. "But you've already lost. Because while you were playing at being a criminal, I was learning how to be a matriarch. And a matriarch always protects her own. Elena signaled to the guards. As they moved in to take Ji-won away to a fate that would never be spoken of in polite society, Elena turned back to Kangdae. She reached out, taking his hand, her signet ring catching the light. "Is it done?" Kangdae asked, his voice thick with emotion. "The surgery was successful," Elena replied, a small, dark smile playing on her lips. "The cancer has been removed." They walked back out into the ballroom together, Minho waiting for them at the edge of the crowd. As the music swelled and the elite of Seoul parted like the Red Sea to let them through, the message was clear. The glass dynasty wasn't shattered. It had been reinforced with steel and soul. The war was just beginning, but for the first time in his life, the king wasn't fighting alone. Beside him stood the doctor who had become a queen, the healer who had learned to erase, and the woman who had turned a golden cage into an empire. The story ended with a single, powerful image. The three of them standing on the balcony of the Hyatt, looking out over the city they now ruled together. The night was cold, but the fire between them was unquenchable. The new dynasty had arrived, and the world would never be the same. Before we close this chapter, I want to take a second to say thank you. Bringing Dr. Elena and Minho's journey to life has been an incredible ride, but it wouldn't mean anything without you. We aren't just a creator and a listener here, we are a family. If you felt that bond today, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our dynasty. And if you haven't told me yet, comment below and let me know where in the world you are watching from. I read every single comment, and I can't wait to meet you there.